Canada is taking the world as it is, not passively waiting for a world we wish to be. We do, however, take this position with regret because the current conflict is another example of the failure of the international order.
One can never categorically rule out participation. We will stand by our allies when it makes sense, but we will always defend Canadians. We will always stand by and defend our allies.
Well, it was a whirlwind of a week for Prime Minister Mark Carney. He is about to head home to Canada after a 9-day international trade trip meant to shore up new export destinations. Now, he started in India, then he went to Australia, and it's all ending right now with a quick stop in Japan. Carney has been making the case in those countries that middle powers must unite to grow critical sectors in energy, technology, and defense. And that's been reflected in the partnerships and agreements that he's reached this week in those sectors. But as you heard in that clip off the top there, he's also faced questions from reporters on foreign policy. Now, first, on whether or not there is still a concern that India is involved in foreign interference, and then on the shifting message about the war in the Middle East. Here to rate the week that was from the Prime Minister is our front bench. Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's now a senior advisor at North Star Public Affairs. Melanie Paradis is former communications director to Aaron O'Toole. She's now the president of Texture Communications. Former interim NDP national director Carl Belanger is here. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And with me in studio, Marie Vastel, an editorial writer with Le Devoir. Melanie, I want to start with you on this one. Do you think that the Prime Minister had a good week or a bad week, or was it somewhere in between?
Oh, I think that he and his team had such great plans for a good week, that they had grand ideas about all the announcements that they were going to make. And then, as it said, events, dear boy, events. He just got railroaded by everything that happened in Iran. You know, I had to think, it's a bit inside baseball, but when you're thinking about which staff you put on the plane with the Prime Minister to go on a big trip like this, because they've been gone for like over a week. It's a long time to go. So you take a bunch of your staff with you. You probably didn't think to take your caucus manager. And in this set of circumstances, that's the one person that they really needed on the Iran message. The Prime Minister put out what I thought, honestly, was a really good balanced message the first time. And that was probably his actual position. And then, you know, at some point at 6 or 7 in the morning, when everybody woke up in Ottawa and they saw the message, people started to freak out in Liberal caucus. And you have to remember, there's people in Liberal caucus who came up with like the war in Iraq and Occupy Wall Street as a movement and have like a very set point of view on U.S. military intervention and don't want to see the Canadian government involved at all. And so I think that in that set of circumstances, it would have been really helpful for them to check in with their caucus manager first before putting out that statement to see if they would need to change it 3 more times afterwards.
Sabrina, how much of that will he have to clean up once he gets back to Ottawa? Even though, as we had heard, the Foreign Affairs Minister, Anita Anand, was seemingly briefing members of caucus today.
Yeah, I think there was that caucus call today. I do think that it's really challenging when you have so much going on and every day is a day where we don't know what Donald Trump is going to do. Case in point, Saturday. I don't know that we would have necessarily pinpointed the Iran war to this past weekend. But I think for the Prime Minister, it's about being able to not just communicate that message to caucus, which I do think is critically important, but what was the message out of the trip this week to Canadians? And I think that that is the more critically important message, right? A lot of it was overshadowed by small things. And I think the small things are the kinds of things that hurt a prime minister or hurt a government. You know, the fact that they didn't take a press conference for several days. I think those are the kinds of things that naggle at you and become the kinds of things that blow up and like bite away at your success. So I think that those pieces of management, as Mel say, are the more important pieces that they need to get under control. Overall, I think he otherwise had a really good week. I think that, you know, he managed to get a lot of good conversations, a lot of good MOUs, MOCs signed across the board with India, with Australia. We'll see what comes out of Japan. And so from that perspective, it does look like the Prime Minister is doing a good job. But how do you manage those pieces that actually, you know, become the small things that eat away at your polling or your strength?
And Carl, I want to sort of go back to something that I know, was spoken about a lot at the beginning of the week, but that there was that briefing from an official before going on this trip where they talked about how, whether or not India was a threat anymore to foreign interference in Canada, and they basically said we wouldn't be going on this trip if that was the case. And then the Prime Minister had to try and explain that. In fact, nearly his whole press conference was overtaken by that. Do you think that Canadians, will remember the MOUs and everything that Sabrina was talking about, or is this trip going to be more remembered for something else?
Well, it depends what happens next when it comes to foreign interference, really. Because, frankly, most Canadians don't pay a lot of attention to this. They are having trouble to, figure out what the Prime Minister's position is on this. But it's a different Prime Minister than the one who was calling the Indian government for murdering Canadians on Canadian soil. Different era, for sure. And, we are in a different world with Donald Trump's trade war. That, again, comes into play. But, the problem with what Mark Carney is weak is that the position has been shifting ever so slightly every day. And it all stems back to his speech in Davos, where he was really, at this point, we can say grandstanding about how we need to stand up to those who decide for their own interests what the rule of law is, and that the middle power needs to stand for themselves and ally with others. Well, frankly, at first, when there was a first test, that was the urine test, the Prime Minister failed. He backed up the power that decided to take the matter into their own hands. Then he decided, well, diplomacy needs to prevail. We need to, look at international law. And then the next day or so, it's like, well, maybe we'll send troops. Maybe not. We don't know, but we're open to it. So for Canadians, it's hard to follow. At the end of the day, though, I'm not sure it's going to hurt him because people are on the side of angels when it comes to what's happening in Iran.
Yeah, and Maria, I mean, there's two sort of sides to this. Is it a shifting message, or is it a shifting situation? Wow, easy for me to say. Or is it a shifting situation that he has to change his message for?
Perhaps it's a shifting situation, but perhaps if he hadn't rushed to come out with a reaction, he would have let it settle a tiny bit and come out with a more nuanced position. I don't think that it's completely backtracking. I think his message in Davos was that the world order has been for a while an illusion and no longer stands, and we have to rearrange our alliances and how we respond to it, which is sort of what he was saying about Iran. The reason that we, with regret, support it, he says, is because the world order has not been able to stop Iran. The problem is all that nuance should have been in it from the get-go, as my colleagues have said. When you start having to nuance it over 4 days, then you look like you're backtracking a little bit. And you also look a little wishy-washy to the U.S., which in the first place you were trying to manage the relationship with by quote-unquote supporting their military operation, and now you look like you're backtracking to them. So it's kind of both counterproductive. I think it also suggested a bit of arrogance from the part of the Prime Minister, where he sometimes seemed to believe that he doesn't have the need to explain himself, whether it is on foreign interference on India, like Carl mentioned, or whether it's on this, on the Iran file. And I don't think that's necessarily a good look. And what happened this week is he overshadowed his own international trip and his agreements. He also eclipsed the fact that he was overshadowing Pierre Poilievre's first international trip, which coincidentally happened on the same week, and we ended up not really talking about Poilievre's trip and his ideas, also partly because while Poilievre was talking about deepening ties with Australia, New Zealand and Great Britain, Mark Carney was signing agreements with Australia and Canberra. So that was also a missed opportunity on his part. So it was a bit of, in French, you say shopping for trouble or self-inflicted wounds on the part of the Prime Minister. And I think it's actually his first tough, kind of bad week since he's been in power.
Yeah. Okay. Unfortunately, we got to leave it on that because we have so much to get to in this show. Thanks to the front bench, Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, Carl Boulanger, and Marie Vastel.